So I know my upload schedule's been inconsistent, and I mean really inconsistent, and it's mostly because I've been bouncing back and forth on what exactly I want to do with Force of Will. Japan is pretty compromised when it comes to the game. There are only a handful of stores in the whole country that still bother to stock product, and even less that host events. And now on top of that, the price of boxes didn't decrease like they did everywhere else because the game is now treated as an import product. It used to be about 40,000 to 50,000 yen every 3 months before ownership of the game changed, which is about 400 to 500 US dollars if you wanted to get a play set of everything. And now it costs almost 100,000 yen every 3 months just to pull everything you need. Keep in mind, this is going with the idea that originally you only needed to buy like maybe 4 boxes or so to get everything, regardless of rarity. And now it seems the accepted amount to buy is a full case or 8 boxes. So there's also no single market in Japan, so if you want to import things, the price also kind of gets up there, and that's assuming that any foreign dealers are actually going to be willing to ship to Japan. Like off of TCG Player, there's I think only 2 people that actually will willingly ship cards to Japan, and it is pretty pricey. I started this channel with the intention of highlighting archetypes or deck styles that I found really interesting or underutilized, and eventually that evolved into combining that aspect with tournament analysis. I really enjoy sort of the social aspect of card games, like getting out there and meeting players, getting to experience different deck styles and play styles in person, and that really was kind of the driving force that kept me in the game after, I guess, 2017 or so. So with Force of Will being killed in Japan and all the events gone, the general direction and the speed of the game now, and sort of the rising cost of product, I just don't have the drive left anymore to really bother playing. I thought about putting a lot of closing thoughts I have with the game into sort of a series of different videos, but it's kind of easier right now to just edit everything together into one big thing. There won't really be that many visual gags in this one, so feel free to just kind of listen in the background to this if you want. Like, just treat it like a podcast. Every other channel for this game has a podcast. This will be my one episode. So I'll make sure to put like a list of topics in the description with timestamps in case you want to jump around, because some of this is going to be personal, some of this is going to be more analytical, and I know some people come for more of the analytical side of things rather than like my own personal feelings. I don't blame you. First topic, let's actually talk about what I like about Force of Will. So, I originally got into Force of Will back at the tail end of Grim Cluster. I had known about the game since its launch, as I'd been casually playing Yu-Gi-Oh! With my friends in college at the time, and the store we'd always go to had the Force of Will boxes lined up on the wall. But I never actually cracked or bought any until one weekend I went to go visit my parents, and a store in my hometown was kind of liquidating some of their stock. And I ended up picking up like the original Light and Win Valhalla starters and a box of Millennia of Ages. You know, the 3 possible best things I could have purchased. 2 illegal decks and a 60 card set of mostly support with no stones and no rulers. I like the art, I was able to get into the gameplay pretty easily, and I like the fact that the game was relatively new. I stuck with Yu-Gi-Oh! For most of my interest with card games up to that point because I had gotten in on the ground floor with it when it first came out back when I was in middle school. Like even Pokemon, I kind of dipped out for a while and never wanted to go back. And Magic, I'm pretty sure, is about as old as I am, and I never really got into it. And when I did, it was so far along that I would be playing catch-up for forever. And like the most popular format there is essentially the same as New Frontiers, but I really like getting immersed in whatever kind of game I'm playing, so getting on the ground floor really does help that. Also, I'm kind of a giant loser, so the anime titty art really appeals more to me, I guess, than whatever Wizards of the Coast is doing. Also, Force of Will is incredibly cheap. you could drop like $450 on 4 boxes every 3 months and essentially get everything you need as long as you're not like trying to hunt the highest rarity possible. As a broke-ass college student with only a little extra income each month, the price of entry into Force of Will compared to like literally every other card game was pretty much where I wanted it. I could actually afford to play a game and still eat decently. And, I never really understood the constant frustration like stores and players seem to have with the lower value of cards and other singles. It seems like the main attraction for the game, at least when people who aren't directly related to the business aspect of things, is just how cheap and affordable the game is. And it really looked like a no-brainer to me when it comes to ordering Force of Will product, which is you essentially just kind of fill pre-orders and then maybe order like a case or so extra. Because Force of Will wasn't a rapidly growing card game. Or not in the sense that like you would just need to make sure you always have boxes in your back. Force of Will also kind of does single print runs. That's really how it's always been. So I think ideally the game plan was that as a store, you would get all your money up front on a set release, and then you continue to support your locals through hosting like events or the Ruler League or whatever. It's not like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic where you can just order like a metric fuck ton of boxes and expect the single market to suddenly turn a profit for you, because Force of Will never really had like those 1 or 2 per box cards that were often like the money cards and everything else. In fact, ordering a bunch of boxes would really just kind of like do you more harm than good, because if the value of cards is already low and you're opening all of these boxes and just putting more cards into circulation, it's just going to tank the value of those things even more. So now you aren't going to make back that $400 or $600 that you dumped on a case. It seems like no one really bothered to kind of pick up on that idea. Instead, it was just easier to treat the game like it's Magic, even though it's not Magic. And then when you can't push all your singles because everybody has them, it's easier to just say the game's dead, and rather than like realize your fuck up and maybe adjust your marketing strategy for the game to better coincide with how it works. No one really seemed, or it seems like no one on the business side of things really bothered to research how Force of Will actually works. It was always just kind of that side thing. I don't know. That's just my experience from all of the different card stores I'd been to. And it's kind of interesting because Force of Will kind of combines all of the consumer-friendly parts of both the Japanese and Western card markets without like the negative balances. So in Japan, boxes for games tend to be a lot cheaper. So like, I'm going to use Yu-Gi-Oh! For example, because I think that's the most relatable game between me and probably most people. So an OCG main set in Yu-Gi-Oh! In Japan will only run you like maybe $30 to $45 US, compared to like the $90 or $100 price tag they tend to have in the TCG. There are less cards per pack, there's like maybe 5, and you aren't guaranteed as many high rarity cards, but that balances out by most of the rare cards and up having multiple rarities. So there's a high rarity version and a low rarity version. If you're just looking to play Yu-Gi-Oh!, you don't have to break the bank every couple of months. You can buy a bunch of cheap boxes, get all the common and uncommon cards, and then fill in the gaps of sort of the higher rarity stuff with whatever their lowest rarity is. And a lot of times those won't go for more than maybe like $2 or $3. Some of the pricier stuff might spike to like 10 or 20, but in general, you really don't have to dump that much on the game unless you're really going for highest rarity. And to oppose that, in the West, you get a lot more cards per pack, but in the TCG, a lot of good cards get rarity spiked, and you're only guaranteed 1 or 2 per box, so ideally more boxes need to be opened. And also many games don't offer that multiple rarity system that Japan has, so it's incentive to force people to buy more product if they want to play the game. It creates a very high value single market, since harder to find cards needed to play a top deck aren't easily accessible to anyone who wants them. And it kind of leads to that mindset of just buy singles, not boxes, which I personally find to be a very unsustainable strategy. Like, if everyone is just waiting to order singles instead of buying product, then there's no one buying product to pull the singles from. And I think we're sort of seeing that in Force of Will right now with shortages on things like Secret Hot Springs, Shock Tea from the previous set, and then pretty much all of Decisive Battle. But the Decisive Battle had a lot more problems than just people not buying boxes. It came down to just the company not even printing the boxes. But what was previously a really nice and consumer-friendly single market has suddenly skyrocketed to a point where the barrier for entry into competitive play is gate-kept by like these absurdly high prices and just a very low supply. But, you know, the fuck do I know, I guess. I mean, it works for card stores. It works for the few people saying that the good single market will heal the game and make it more appealing, but I don't know. I'm not seeing it. There's also been like this really weird joke that Force of Will is constantly in this flux of being dead and not dead, which has been around since like the game started. Honestly, I never saw the game in this constant back and forth that most other people were looking at it as. Instead, I kind of always thought Force of Will is this weird tier 2 game. Its staying power wasn't dependent on its resale value, which seemed to be what a lot of people were comparing it with. So things like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pokemon or Magic are always going to be the big three, and they're going to have their staying power, and they have their market. And that works for them because of just the sheer size of the game. But for something like Force of Will, simply creating that kind of market while it has such a small player base, I don't think is going to help it stick around. And I don't know if it was by pure luck or if Force of Will Co. actually thought about it, but they did like a bunch of really smart things that I think are the main reason the game stayed relevant. And the most important of those is something that would probably make any marketing executive contemplate committing suicide, which was treating their customers like they're actual people. So Force of Will's livelihood was based on its community, not just the player-exclusive community, but also the community built between the game company and the players. I really can't think of a single other card game that did player engagement on anywhere near the same level as Force of Will. There was always someone more involved in the game's executive branch that was engaging with the players on a regular basis. You could hear about events straight from the TO's mouth on Facebook. Judges would answer questions, help with setup for new players to take judge exams at events, and in general just like friendly people worth talking to if you ever got the chance. I'm not saying other games lack this, but most of the competitive community was aware of the people running Force of Will on a first-name basis. As for like public relations, Jeff and Jordan both kind of filled the role of English relations and player engagement, and while Jordan didn't engage much on Facebook, like other company personalities, he laid the groundwork for doing player Q&A streams. He actively kept social media updated, and kind of before his departure had even begun experimenting with player-submitted articles on the official Force of Will website. It was a great direction for the game to be taking, and it offered opportunities to members of the community that most other games just don't do. Jeff continued this by giving more engaging streams, more colorful commentary on spoiler pages, and actively talked with players outside of just his streams. If you ever had the opportunity to sit down and chat with him, he'd willingly talk to you about his and the company's philosophies on design, marketing, and player engagement, while also like trying to get the feedback loop going and hear your opinions too. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone outside of Japan really had that opportunity. Maybe some of the other well-known players, because I know he often would consult with them and their opinions on how to approach things like the ban list and what was too powerful or wasn't powerful enough. I also like that both of them would actively acknowledge when things were wrong with the game. I know Jordan only did it once, but it was calling out the stupidity of zero-cost regalia cards in the original Alice Cluster. A thing that actively got fixed in Alice Cluster's later half, like starting with Moonlit Savior, there were still zero-cost regalia, but you were also starting to see three-cost regalia too. Schrodinger was in Twilight Wonder, and then there was Excalibur. And then in the fourth set, there was just no regalia at all. And even in the Vingolf set, the regalia there all had a cost associated with them. And then when the cluster ended, they just didn't do it again. Jeff often talked about like the current state of the game's balance and meta, which in general gave a nice sense that the company at least had someone monitoring how the game was doing, because for several really brief stints, it looked like no one at the company really cared, and it straight up took like the entirety of the European region kind of hardballing the company with their own instated ban list to actually get something official done about it. Calling out flaws is a big part of why I think Force of Will's PR is so good pre-New Valhalla. It also kind of helps set a precedence of what to expect, where the company was willfully aware that the game would often dip into these states where players weren't happy, and they would come out and address it. And even outside of just gameplay, even other decisions, they would like openly state when something just didn't work. I think a good example was on one of Jeff's streams. He was reflecting on his and AG's thoughts on making Time Spinning Witch a buy 3 exclusive, and how initially a lot of people were like, this is a horrible idea. And then after it happened, they're like, yeah, this is a really horrible idea. And they intended to never make a box promo exclusive again because of how it harmed players. I'm sure there were other complications with like printing a 3-sided card, but the choice was framed in a way to treat the customer base with respect. Which, I guess iSpy deleted that memo off their desk, but I don't know. Connect you with the world was the very Japanese-English statement of purpose for Force of Will Co. And I think they stuck with that idea all the way until their demise last year. They gave a sense that there were real humans running the game, and they were willing to at least try and make things work. They reached out to bridge that gap not only between players around the world, but also between the players and their employees and associates. It didn't feel like Force of Will was being organized by a soulless machine. And that openness is part of what I think kept the game alive through most of its first 5 years, because even if the game was not as much of a monetary success as Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pokemon, you always had like these faces and personalities you could associate the game with, and that sort of human side to things is just a huge grasping point in keeping smaller projects going. And, all of this is good, but I haven't really talked that much about the gameplay, and isn't that kind of what's important with card games? And, of course, and Force of Will has one of the most unique aspects in card design, and that's the ruler. I know a lot of people would say, well, Magic has Commander, and that's fine, but Commander isn't Magic's main format. Force of Will's identity as a game is designed with the aspects and workings of the ruler and the stone deck, and what it's like to have this card that acts as sort of the cornerstone for everything else you're building. And I've always thought the ruler was Force of Will's most interesting concept, because it's, as I said before, it's designed to be this balance point for the deck, and oftentimes the variety found in the game comes from how the player uses their ruler. Maybe that's why I've kind of found myself falling off of the game these last couple of years, because rulers really took a huge backseat in being key parts of a deck to just being like generic cost reducers for other cards. The rulers themselves lack identity. In the original Valhalla cluster, card designs were kind of all over the place. Some rulers would have ties to specific archetypes or playstyles, but it seemed more like the game was finding its footing and figuring out what it wanted to do. Because of this, you ended up with several rulers who had really unique but sometimes broken effects, and several other boring and underwhelming rulers. Advantage really was the name of the game, and no matter what your ruler did, it didn't mean much when Loki, Kronos, and Eubolos existed to like OTK you as soon as possible before you could even finish setting up. And color identity, while not really 100% present, was kind of a thing in original Valhalla cluster. You could mostly see this with the associated wizard rulers, whose effects are closely tied to what most people would say are the stereotypes of the colors they're in. Then later, when the game sort of branched out into North America, Grim Cluster is where a large chunk of players kind of hopped in. And it's also where some of the more tailored design choices in the game started to show up, and the roots of how they want to build the game start to kind of dig in. There's still plenty of rulers who adhere to color identity, like Little Red the Wolf Girl, who is an aggro ruler, Abdul, who is a darkness, like field removal, hard control ruler, and the original Sherry, who is meant to be like this tutor and draw advantage ruler. But there's also a start in more like concept-based designs, and concept is closer to archetype, and Grim is like the perfect example of that. So Grim's tutoring and fairy tale gimmick had absolutely nothing to do with his color. Also, like Seer of the Blue Moon is kind of a jumbled mess of a card. She's associated with treasury items, but she really fits into a reactionary playstyle by making use of the standby area, which is an often ignored mechanic. And then later, Moon Priestess introduced Grimmia and Kane, two of the first sort of J-ruler-centric decks that did more than just beat for big damage. Okay, not really, but they had rather like unique ways of making use of additions, which unfortunately never got brought back into the game. And sort of speaking of additions, even Puss in Boots and the Musketeers operated as their own sort of unique engine. They're a good example of how cards could be blanket designed to be placed in one archetype while still having their own gimmicks to be used individually. Grim Cluster is where the experimental tools of the game really started to settle in, as the design team figured out how they wanted to handle card design. The game was obviously not in perfect equilibrium, but you could find a ruler for just about any playstyle, whether it was aggro, toolbox, hard control, or whatever the hell Lumia was designed to do. The following three clusters, Alice, Lapis, and Rhea, are what I like to think of as the game's golden age in design. Rulers were mostly unique, they had a variety of playstyles, and because there were so many added in each set, there wasn't really a color identity that was strictly adhered to. However, rulers were still pretty well defined, like so well defined in fact that you could often sum them up and their gimmick in just a sentence or two. So here are some examples. So see if you can kind of guess who I'm talking about. I'll put all the reveals at the end. So first, they can add a machine from the deck to the hand once each turn by paying its printed cost, and they're also the first void-centric ruler. They can look at the top card of the deck whenever they want, and they are centered around combos. They can do small amounts of damage to resonators to build up counters for use after they flip. They can play their opponent's cards that are removed from the game. They sacrifice resources to play big monsters from outside the game. They can remove cards in the graveyard to pay for spells, and also search a spell once per turn by recycling what they removed. They trade an exclusive gem resource to power their own unique effects, and many of their support cards also use or generate these resources. They can only play one copy of a card in the deck, but they generate a lot of value with their specific support. So were you able to guess any of them? In order, it would have been Machina, Xion, Mikage, Red-Black Lapis, Lilia's Petal, Gil, Tigris, and Ayu. Now, let's push ahead a bit to the next cluster. So think about New Valhalla rulers. What exactly is their identity? All of the New Valhalla cards have this blank starting side, are intended to be used in conjunction with a rune deck, but there isn't much of a restriction tied to which ruler can use which runes. The only existing one is that pure runes can only be used with a ruler of matching color, but something that's a rune or master rune / chant is fair game for anybody. So it really doesn't restrict much, since pure runes only existed in the first and only line of starter decks that came out at the beginning of the game. So let's actually try to break down a new Valhalla ruler, just to see what unique aspects they have. I really like machines, so how about Arthur? I know there are runes that are meant to be his, but you can play all but one of those with Loki, which most people did since she was just the better blue ruler, until people realized Hanzo was actually the best ruler to mix with machines because none of the blue exclusive runes were actually that good. and Hanzo giving you that cancel spell was way better than whatever the hell Loki or Arthur could offer you. And to compare, SKL Machina searches out machines like an assembly line. You can translate his ability into a tangible action that he's building machines before he deploys them. It gives him an identity. The ability to tutor his specific void type cards is a unique trait that only he possesses, and it also kind of falls in line of what you think of when you hear the word machine. So, what unique interactions does Arthur have through his specific master runes? He destroys things by putting them in piles. And then he got another one later that lets him destroy things by doing damage in piles. Both of these effects are done by multiple other cards in New Valhalla, so it's not very unique, and also it's not really machine-like. I can't really think of a way to translate that like I would Machina's abilities. To sort of juxtapose that, New Valhalla machines do have a unique identity to them. They add +1/+1 counters, which you can put in a machine-like action. It's almost like the machines themselves support each other, where they're providing ammunition or upgrades, which they can then later spend to do things. You know, maybe Arthur could disassemble his machines and repurpose them. There's a lot of cards that reference updating and rebuilding in New Valhalla, so maybe he could have a way to redistribute counters like he's equalizing his forces out. You know, maybe there could have been a Divinity 10 Master Rune for him released later in the game that said something like, you can only play this card if your J/ruler is Arthur. As long as this rune is face up in your rune deck, your J-ruler gains the following abilities. Remove 2 +1/+1 counters from an entity you control. Put a +1/+1 counter on this card. You can remove a +1/+1 counter from this card to put a +1/+1 counter, or 1 counter of any type, on an entity you control. Or maybe you could just put all that bullshit on a 2-cost resonator that costs 2 colors and nobody's going to use. And just give Arthur the ability to mill the top 5 cards of his deck, and maybe he gains counters equal to the cost of 2 of those milled cards instead of all 5. This is how all the new Valhalla rulers really feel to me. No one plays a specific ruler because they do something good. They do it because that ruler has a cheap rune or overtuned resonator that benefits only them just because they exist. Hanzo's entire meta-existence since he was released has had nothing to do with his typing or support. Being a cat, being a ninja, none of that matters, but it's entirely focused on the fact that his Master Rune is a free counterspell. No Hanzo deck actually cared about what Hanzo did. He could have been in light, fire, water, or darkness, and he still would have been one of the top rulers of the format as long as he had that Master Rune. In fact, that kind of happened for a brief stint. At Worlds, Brunhild and Adam became much stronger rulers closer to the end of the format, and they kind of passed Hanzo in viability, while essentially still running the same white-green control deck that he used. This problem is very easy to fix, though, as I tried to show with Arthur, so let's look at another one. Let's say Ruler Isis gained a new Master Rune that was Divinity 10 and said as long as this card is revealed in your rune deck, your J/ruler gains moon additions you control gain rest, produce red or white. You may only play this rune if your ruler is Isis. Then it would be something you could tie directly to her. Just putting that crap on a 4 of Resonator doesn't make playing Ruler Isis fun. It makes her a necessity since you need her name, but it walls your gimmick behind a removable body, so your entire strategy can just get disrupted in an instant. There are, of course, other limiting factors to just kind of slapping a will production ability on a rune, but I'm not really arguing for balance, more of just identity. So this type of design gives access to the rune deck, but it also gives the ruler a specific identity in exchange for giving up their rune deck. Hell, this actually makes Hanzo the only ruler that could run a Divinity 10 Master Rune and give him the ability to flip it back down so he can make use of the rest of his rune deck post-judgment. Something that could have given him a potential identity other than just being the no fun allowed cat. The rune deck itself was really underutilized, and as a result, so were most of the new Valhalla rulers. Imagine if there were less rune chants, or rune chants only ended up in white, which was Adam's associated color, and Adam is the ruler who gains bonuses from using runes after you flip him. Imagine if runes were more tightly held to specific rulers. They could then, in theory, be more powerful or provide a variety of ways to use each ruler without having to worry about making generic strategies too strong. This also makes it possible for certain unsupported archetypes to get the support they would need to actually work. Rulers like Fuji or Loki could have actually been able to function the ways they were intended if they just had more specific support. Like, for some reason, New Valhalla was convinced it needed to structure itself around sealed play, and that when you open a pack, you shouldn't end up with a pure rune because you're not going to have the ruler to use it. But I think that design choice is ultimately what made New Valhalla really boring and unfun, at least for me. You were hopping around based on runes rather than what type of unique strategy you can make out of a deck. And the Stranger deck in Alice Origin seems to be going the same way too. Instead of making rulers unique and giving them defined identities, you have a bunch of really cookie cutter designs with one or two variations. Like, all the rulers have access to a Stranger deck. They all get a choice of 4 effects whenever they play a regalia in a matching color, 2 if it's their own named regalia, and 2 of those effects are always the same, reducing the cost of judgment to 0, effectively giving all Alice Origin rulers a 2-cost judgment, and the ability to add a Stranger to hand. The other 2 abilities, at least for the first set of rulers, involve some form of a plus in either hand or field advantage, and then some form of removal. Machina kinda goes against this, and Pricia does a bit too, with their abilities being a bit more tooled towards their specific ideas, but without regalia, all Alice Origin rulers are essentially just pieces of cardstock used to call stones. There is no variety in how the specific ruler is used. They all want to rush out their regalia to start reaping benefit. To try and put this into perspective, Melgus alone isn't scary as an aggro J ruler, but a turn 3 Melgus that played Levitain, got a free judgment, a 700 attack token, a free Stranger on enter, and still has the will to pay for a second Stranger through his God's Art is a potential game ender. None of that has anything to do with Melgus's identity outside of just putting a Stranger into the field, but instead is all built around the fact that he has this 2-cost get a bunch of value card that works only for him. At least the J-Ruler sides of these cards have some variety to them. I already kind of talked about Melgus, who arguably is the only unique one so far since he put Strangers straight into the field. And that ability kind of matches directly with what he did in Battle for Atarectia. In comparison, the other 2 Alice Origin 1 rulers, Faria and Lenneth, are just generically bad. They have no focus in their design. There's no obvious gimmick they're meant to work towards. And their associated archetypes are either rehashes of now power-crept cards that are lacking their main boss, or are horribly constructed to the point that they barely function. Like, to the point where people were actually arguing rules-wise that there's no way the company would design Lenneth to be so horribly gimped and just cut her support straight out because ruling won't let you play Ouroboros or Izanami's ability with her regalia. I honestly think that neither Faria nor Melgus should have had the Stranger keyword. Introduce 1 Stranger ruler each set, make it so they all interact with Strangers in a vastly different way, and instead play up the Alice Cluster revival cards by building them around their already established identities. God knows there's enough variants of them all already to just easily assign them a working gimmick. Give Faria some kind of tie to life gain that isn't horrible to play with or against. It's entirely possible to make a healing-themed ruler function, and that got skipped for the 4th time to just reintroduce knights, but we don't get the good Arthur boss monster they had because they wanted to shoehorn in the OG Valhalla Arthur, who can't do anything for knights because he's tied to this RNG mechanic that is just completely unreliable. And I already said that I think Machina and Pricia have these sort of unique aspects to them, but really it's the same thing. Neither of them care about flipping. They just want to reap benefits off of their regalia. For Machina, he's still cursed with the pick 4 effects thing and nothing else on his ruler side. And his unique gimmick seems to be tied to Type 0, which is a card that dies to a 1-cost red chant. Which is unfortunate because the current best deck in the format is a red deck. But what if instead of when he flips, instead of becoming a big stupid beater, he was dedicated to protecting Type 0 by, say, he could discard cards to give her barrier, or you could remove cards from the top of your deck face down to give her an instance of Eternal. Like, lore-wise, this version of Machina is the one who went through the grief of seeing Maria Bella die and building the robot, and he wants to protect that robot above all else. But you don't really get that in his identity from just what he does. Instead, he just places 1/1 counters on Maria Bella, and then at some point he's supposed to flip, and then they have to live for a turn, and then I assume he's supposed to get game. But that's not really machine-like. It doesn't really match or even hint at any type of gimmick he had in the original Alice cluster, and it doesn't line up with his lore. And I know there are protection cards for Type 0 in water from his associated types, but those are so generic that they're not tied to Machina. You can use those with any other ruler. So if for some reason, let's just say Arthur Loki, one of the rune rulers, suddenly becomes a better way to play Maria Bella, well then Machina has no reason to exist, especially if there's a better stranger ruler than him. Okay, so I covered most of my issues with Alice Origin in the ruler segment, but really just this cluster feels like a nightmare. Like, Pricia, just in general, shows almost everything I dislike about the current state of the game. A good 80% of her deck just gives a straight plus. Like, less than a year ago, like prior to her release, the community was asking for a ban to Sacrificial Altar, a 2-cost card that let you combo into high-cost bodies by sacrificing other resonators off your field. It has combo potential with other cards from New Valhalla, but it is nothing compared to Secret Hot Spring, which, for just one wind, Pricia gets to tutor a card, put herself 33% of the way to her counter gimmicks threshold, and then she can play the card she tutored for free on either player's turn once her friendship counters hit 3, which is piss easy to do by turn 2. And speaking of turn 2, if you don't have 1-cost addition removal, which only 2 colors do, you'll potentially be looking down at a field of 3 bodies on the following turn. Or at the very least, her having successfully hit her friendship counter threshold. There is currently no deck that can generate the sheer amount of value she does for the same low cost. And the game is going to shift towards the same extremes that it hit the last time Pricia was the top deck in the format. Like, you either played Pricia or a solid hard control deck that could stall her until she ran out of gas. Except I'm not even sure this current Pricia can run out of gas, since every card in her deck is packing diesel. There won't be any room for mid-range strategies, and even decks that were considered extremely fast and powerful before her release have now effectively been shoved out of the way or forced into more control-heavy variants to try and keep her in line. Also, strangers are absolutely stupid and unfun. This has to be one of the worst gimmicks a cluster has ever introduced. There's almost no strategy to the way strangers are implemented. They're mostly bloated on stats, and their effects are relatively cheap when you consider how effective they are to the printed cost of the resonator. The way they work is there's no ruler that lets you just pick what stranger you want. It's all random. So when someone gets a good stranger, or a stranger that just does way too much at the state of the game that you're in, it's because you lost to a dice roll. You didn't lose because your opponent necessarily had a better strategy than you. You lost because they lucked out and just got something that you had to waste all your resources to deal with and then couldn't disrupt their strategy, or just got hit by something you had no answer to. Like, allow me to illustrate some examples of just what, like, these strangers can do. There's a 3-cost 2000 that brings in a stone rested when he's played. There's a 3-cost 1000 that punishes anything stronger than it when it's blocked. There is another version of Kaguya that is just slightly weaker, but it fulfills the same role. It's a cancel with a body. There are multiple low-cost bounce effects that can lead to you either abusing your own enter effects again, or disrupting fields while still giving you a +1 in advantage for like 1 or 2. Then there's the reprint of Treasure Tree, which has been absurd in just about every form it's been in. And this one's no exception. It's a graveyard setup, it's an insane amount of mana ramp, and it's essentially free. And yeah, strangers really are almost free. They cost, like, you might as well consider them costing 2 less than whatever is printed on them, because they can be paid for with regalia. And there's also like an insane amount, if not equally free, ways to just dig them out at a surprisingly fast speed. Like, Pricia and Machina both introduced 1-cost cards that have ways to just get a stranger and also give you a different beneficial effect. And Pricia's technically costs 2, so that uses your regalia to get the stranger to your hand, but at the same time you are also removing something from the field. And Machina's is dependent on him having Maria Bella on the field, but it's a +2 in hand advantage, or I guess it's a +1 in hand advantage, because the card replaces itself with a draw, and then you also get the stranger. And because that costs so little, you necessarily don't have to use your regalia to pay for it. And in fact, it's probably better to just hold on to that card until the next turn, when you can pay for it, and save the regalia for the stranger you're going to dig out. And just like with runes, strangers themselves have no restrictions outside of the RNG used to pull them. I mean, theoretically, there is a restriction based on what colors you have to pay to play them, but since dual stones are being reintroduced now, those restrictions are just kind of slowly going away. And on like the corporate side of things, I've had a lot of problems with the distribution of Alice Origin. I don't like that we're essentially down to 60 card sets. So the last 2 sets have had 40 cards that are 1 per pack, or I guess 2 per pack, because it's 2 sets of 20. And then the other 20 to 30 cards fill in like 5 to 6 slots. And this is ignoring the wasted space on basic stones being added back to packs, the absolutely useless Memoria promotional reprints. There is no reason for those to exist. Like, things that were reprinted in Alice Cluster, that's an interesting way to sort of reintroduce alternate artworks of those cards, but the vast majority of Memoria cards are just a waste. And this is definitely my personal opinion. I think the borders on these cards look like absolute garbage. It looks like something that was run through a Photoshop program or like a template, and then they just printed that on all of them. I liked Force of Will's kind of minimalistic approach to sort of showing off the artwork of the card, and the borders on these things, and the stranger cards too, just inherently goes against that. But that's personal opinion. Like, there's a lot of other things too. I'm sad that there's a lack of a Japanese print run now, because that really did just kind of do in the community over here. And like, I completely understand. The game was struggling in Japan in 2018 when I came over, so it's no surprise that this region would be dropped if new ownership was looking for ways to save money. There were only a handful of stores carrying product compared to in its heyday, and the number just kind of got smaller and smaller as time went on. Most of the major chain stores had already given up on it, like there's Big Magic, Amenity Dream, and Yellow Submarine, and Yellow Sub was really the only major chain carrying Force of Will at that time. So most of Force of Will's Japanese support was coming from smaller local stores. And the thing is, GP turnout in Japan was really good. Japanese events would almost always fill, if not slightly overfill. So really, the problem was in local support, which I think is relatively easy to bring back, especially in Japan, where there's so many stores and it's so easy to kind of hand out like these just smaller tournament prizes, like the promo cards or Energize coins. For a while, at least at the first GP of New Valhalla Cluster Japan, they were experimenting with giving players the option to like buy an Energize coin. And everyone went wild, and most of us bought like everything. Like just about everybody left with a full set of all the rulers from New Valhalla. And imagine if like those things could just get shipped to local stores and created incentives for smaller tournament scenes. The ability to revive the game was there. It's just no one wanted to put in the work to do it. And I don't think the game's ever going to come back to Japan. Like, especially not after the cold treatment a lot of the Japanese players were given over the last 2 years. So, first, Tokyo GP was canceled due to security reasons. There were no security issues in Tokyo 2 years ago. Then all GPs were just removed without explanation. This was around the time when all the GPs got taken down in North America too, except Japan didn't have somebody to smack I Spy upside the head and say, you can't do this. So they just took everything down. Then there wasn't even an announcement that Japanese product was going to be stopped. Stores just didn't get order sheets, except for in English. And when the majority of your player base doesn't speak English, it's understandable most of them aren't going to order your product. And then after that, the Japanese website went down, and I know the English site was pretty barren outside of spoiler stuff, but the Japanese site actually did like a really good job of keeping up with the competitive meta. You could always find tournament posts. You could always find top 8 deck lists. It was great. And that was just all gone. Once again, no warning, no nothing. Just one day it was all taken down. I only found out because I wanted to do another video involving Japanese cards. And whoop-de-fucking-do, I couldn't get the Japanese card art anymore because the website was gone. And then this is mostly anecdotal because I wasn't able to go to Worlds this past year. But the 3 Japanese players weren't, treated as well as I assume some of the others were. And if someone can correct me on this, please do. But to my knowledge, so the Japanese players went, they had to write their deck lists down. But since there's no Japanese speaking judge, they were told they had to rewrite their deck lists in English. So the people checking the deck list could make sure. Well, the Japanese players play with Japanese cards, so they don't always know the English names of the cards, and in this panic moment, they were being asked to completely redo these deck lists in a different language that I know at least 2 of them really aren't as developed in speaking and understanding. Like, they can read it, but they don't know the names of the cards off the top of their head. And they just didn't have the opportunity to do that, and that just like set them on tilt, and they just didn't perform as well. And I think like burning all that goodwill, even if for some reason they did want to bring Force of Will back over in Japan, I just think that's gone. I think that ship has sailed and it's never coming back. I kind of saw a lot of that mindset, and I still do, spilling over into the treatment of the Western player base too. Like, the North American TO under Forza Wilco had to convince iSpy to not fully drop the tournament series. This is, once again, anecdotal from a different source, but the CEO of ARG was supposed to have a meeting with the iSpy CEO about continuing the circuit series, and the iSpy CEO just didn't show up to the meeting. Not like they canceled it, they just didn't show up. There's also no iSpy representative currently handling PR at all. Like, there's no official representative. I know the company like pays certain influencers in product to kind of push this really positive view of the game and everything, but there's no Jeff, there's no Jordan, there's no person who represents the company directly that sort of fills that void of saying we care about the players and we're listening to their needs and what they're looking for. And I don't have a problem with that, with the promotion aspect getting shoved off to the content creators. That was kind of what Jordan was doing when articles were being written by players. So it's a step in the right direction, but it just feels so weird and cold. It's like either you're super excited for the game and you love every aspect of it, or you just don't talk, which is not something I like. I think if you enjoy Force of Will, that's great. If you have fun with the game right now, that's great. But it's just so strange to me how, like, oddly quiet any complaints are when the game is heavily shifting towards a style of play that was complained about a lot in the past. I'm just saying, over a year ago, when there were some complaints, there was a thread made to get in contact with the people in charge of the game and just ask them a bunch of questions. A lot of it was PR stuff, some of it was like pointless lore crap, but most of it was things wondering about the future of the game. And that thread just got buried. It got brought up once or twice, and the people who brought it up were just kind of shut down. And for most of the community, they're not invested competitively, or they don't care. And it just seems like it was okay to accept that as long as we get our card stock, who gives a shit what the game does? Which really isn't how I personally feel about this game or what I liked about the community. And I know I've been complaining, and this is definitely going to end in some more complaining, but I want to point out some things that I do think are kind of cool. I like that the game is updating archetypes, even if I think the way they're doing it is like sticking a band-aid over an amputation wound. Goddesses, Gorgons, Knights of the Round Table, none of those are ever going to be good, and it's because the first two got one or two support cards that are just big blowouts, and then nothing else, and then Knights in general just got nothing. It's insane that they're trying to hype up this nostalgia and then they don't properly support it. Even though I think that's definitely a good way to go about bringing in old players if that's what they want to do. But really, it just comes down to the same stupid bullshit we saw at the end of New Valhalla, where instead of getting actual printed support, the card designer just seems to have this fetish for mass summon spells, and it's just really boring and stupid. Every color had a mass summon card by the end of New Valhalla, and so far we have a mass summon spell for goddesses, we have a mass summon spell for Gorgons. All of Pricia's cards might as well be mass summon spells. Every archetype is trying to do the same end game, and it's really boring because you just pick the one that does it the best. Another positive, I generally like the theming of the archetypes. Decisive Battle of New Valhalla introduced a lot of really cool ideas that I wish had been handled better, and I kind of wish a lot of these things had been introduced earlier. Fuji's emblem mechanic is really cool. and it makes him an interesting ruler. I just kind of wish that had been introduced like 2 sets prior and had been given some room to grow so it could actually do something. But, it's whatever. Also, I like that the US tournament scene at least seems to be coming back. I know we're in the midst of a viral pandemic, unfortunately, but at least effort sort of has been shown that the company cares about the competitive aspect, although I really don't think I Spy is the people pulling the strings on the tournament scene. I think it's somebody else, and for some reason they're just not allowed to label themselves as the TO for the game. I guarantee you a Japanese company where it is illegal to have prize money for things like card games are not the people deciding that 2GPs should have cash prizes, especially after the last cash prize event that the person in charge of the game now had to deal with pretty much led to him losing his position, created a bunch of generally negative PR for the game, and essentially like ruined that whole cash tournament series that was tested in North America. Like I promise you that I Spy is not the people setting up the tournaments. I'm just really convinced that the people in charge of the game have no idea how to do major events or what they need to do to organize them. And while I do like appreciate that there are people who care about it, I just wish they were more open about it. Also, I think losing ARG was a really big hit to the game's health in North America, because even if there weren't many people playing, ARG is such a mix of different card games that people who normally wouldn't see Force of Will were getting exposed to it. And there's a chance, well, maybe someone will see the game, be interested, and pick it up. That actually happened at a couple of ARG events I went to. Me and some of the people I went with would end up talking with people outside the events or between rounds who were there playing something else but were interested in Force of Will, and we'd end up like, hey, we can help you set up a deck or show you what to do. And it gets people interested. And there are groups sort of filling that void of smaller tournaments that the Circuit Series used to create and ARG States used to create, but they don't have the same reach. Like, right now, Force of Will is more like a consolidated clubhouse where the people who know about Force of Will and playing it are people who already knew about Force of Will. You're not really inducting new players into the game. And I think they should have tried to keep the ARG series. It's just so odd to me that they would cancel that. Because, like, if you wanted a tournament organization to run events for your game so you don't have to do it, ARG would have been the perfect thing to do that with. But instead that led to a whole different offshoot of drama, which I don't want to go into. I do think the game needs more mini events. People aren't going to buy product if they can't play. Like, the Force of Will is not going to survive off of a casual player base. And considering how massive North America is, which is kind of their main market, most people aren't going to dump the funds to travel to every major GP across the continent. Most people are only going to go to one, if there's even one near them. And, like, stop scheduling GPs on the day of product release. I know it kind of hides how bad card design is, and it gives the like illusion that the game might be in a healthy state, but it's not good because people don't have time to test things. Like, some people will be dedicated and they'll go online and they'll play in like their secret untap rooms or whatever, or just on Skype or talking with friends, but not everyone is going to do that. A lot of people will want to play with the actual physical product, and they can't do that if they have to buy the product 10 minutes before they have to submit their deck list. With the past event, I think Pricia was like an overwhelming majority of it. Like 75% of Pricias that signed up for Vegas topped. And other than that, like, the top 8 was pretty diverse. But how much of that top 8 was diverse because either A, people couldn't get the cards they needed, so they had to run older decks, or B, players just weren't used to playing with the new cards yet, so they would rather go with something that's familiar, or see how many of those newer decks topped for the inverse reason, where the people they were fighting didn't know what those decks did just yet. So they lost on the principle of new product that they hadn't been able to experiment with yet. And I think the next major GP comes out the day after the Ghost in the Shell set comes out. Whatever, despite my complaints, I don't think the game is actively dying. Or, at least not at the doomsday rate that word dying is typically associated with. The game just really isn't going in a direction I agree with. And it's kind of this direction they've been going in since the start of New Valhalla. If you enjoyed the format that Divinity and Strangers have enabled, then more power to you. It's just really not my thing, and I really don't like trying to build decks around those styles. There's also the fact that we're like entering this format where a lot of things are like 1 to 2 turn setups for kill combos, which also I just don't think is very fun. For example, playing against Isis is not fun. She has a gimmick that puts you on a timer, and you just have to slowly watch that timer go up, and there's really nothing you can do to get rid of her additions to set her behind. You just kind of have to hope you can throw off Isis before she hits that 9 moon threshold and kills you in one swing. And kind of as for the direction of this channel, I don't really know what I'm going to do yet. I've been sitting on a lot of scripts for a while. Just kind of the motivation to get in there and do anything with them is just gone. Maybe I'll put out 1 or 2 more archetype analysis, but I just actively hate trying to deck build now, as I said before. It's kind of always my goal to try and put together the best deck possible in a format for whatever I'm talking about, but we're at a point where the best cards can literally just be splashed into any deck, so it just makes it really boring and unfun. And I'm not going to gimp myself and say, well, I could have put Dark Alice in this, but I didn't want to use her. That's not how it works. It's like, if I'm making a deck, I want to make that deck as strong as I can, even if the gimmick itself isn't going to be competitively viable. Although, I do have a few lists floating around. I was originally going to play until the Ghost in the Shell set came out, because I can't afford to drop, it would be about $2,000 in 1 month for Ghost in the Shell, and then the Alice Origin 3 set in the same month, just based on Japan's import prices. So, but the virus has closed down a lot of stores over here. Most places don't actually have their play areas active, so even the store I go to, they heavily restrict what events can happen. So I guess I'm just out. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on it all. If you have any sort of, I guess, counterpoints to it, please feel free to post them. I think discussion is the healthiest part of this game, and I really haven't been able to have any of that discussion for a long time. And it's just so difficult to not have to endlessly praise this game to be heard. I don't even know what I'm talking about anymore. So yeah, peace.